one response, and that was the response from Hamas. And as the Prime Minister said, last night we received a response. Hamas has proposed numerous changes to the proposal that was on the table. We discussed those changes last night with Egyptian colleagues and today with the Prime Minister. Some of the changes are workable, some are not. In the days ahead, we are going to continue to push on an urgent basis with our partners, with Qatar, with Egypt, to try to close this deal, because we know it's in the interests of Israelis, Palestinians, the region, indeed, the entire world. And we all agree that the deal has to be grounded in the principles of the ceasefire proposal that the entire international community supports. I can't speak for Hamas or answer for Hamas, and ultimately, it may not be the path that Hamas wants to pursue. But Hamas cannot and will not be allowed to decide the future for this region and its people.
Some 117 million people were forcibly displaced by the end of 2023, marking the highest number on record, according to the latest statistics from the United Nations Refugee Agency. Speaking earlier this week, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said the number of forcibly displaced people has been increasing every year for the past 12 years.
The last figure that we have been sharing with you, if you recall, was 114 million. So we estimate that the most updated figure is now 120 million. So it has gone up by another 6 million. These are refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, being forced by conflict, by persecution, by different and increasingly complex forms of violence.
The UN's new report on global trends in displacement estimates the number has only increased in the first 4 months of 2024. with conflict being a major driver of displacement. Grandi singled out the war in Sudan as one of the most catastrophic ones.
It is a crisis that, and this is not applying to you who report from here, so hear about that a lot, but generally doesn't really make it to the headline. It's a very forgotten crisis, although it's one of the most catastrophic ones, not just in terms of displacement, but in terms of hunger, lack of access, violation of human rights, and so forth.
Speaking on Gaza, Grandi cautioned that with Israel's offensive forcing around 1.7 million people into internal displacement, that's nearly 80% of the population, many of them displaced multiple times, people fleeing Israel's military operations from the southern border town of Rafah into Egypt could lead to catastrophic consequences, especially, he says, because there's no guarantee they'll be able to return.
Joe Biden will sign a new security agreement with Ukraine at the G7 summit on Thursday, according to a top U.S. official. The president on Wednesday departed for Italy on Air Force One for his meeting with leaders of the Group of Seven democracies. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters on the flight the agreement would make clear that U.S. support for Ukraine would, quote, last long into the future, particularly in the defense and security space. Sullivan added the pact will include a commitment to working with the U.S. Congress on funding Ukraine going forward, but will not commit to using U.S. forces on the ground. The White House had said earlier that Biden will meet again with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the summit. G7 leaders will address multiple challenges during the June 13th to 15th meeting. They include wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, trade imbalances with China, threats posed by artificial intelligence, and development challenges in Africa. Shoring up funding for Ukraine will be a top priority. U.S. and European officials are eager to lock in solutions ahead of a possible Trump re-election and the uncertainty it would raise over future U.S. support for Kyiv. Sullivan said the U.S. is, quote, making good progress on an innovative plan to use Russian assets frozen in the West to provide Ukraine with a large upfront loan to secure Kyiv's financing for 2025. Biden will press other G7 leaders to agree to using some $281 billion of Russian central bank funds to back up a $50 billion loan to Ukraine.
Both Israel and Hamas had committed war crimes in the early stages of the war in Gaza, a UN inquiry found on Wednesday. It also says Israel's actions constituted crimes against humanity because of the immense civilian losses. The findings were from two parallel reports published by the UN Commission of Inquiry, one focusing on the October 7th Hamas attacks and another on Israel's military response in Gaza. Israel did not cooperate with the commission, which it says has an anti-Israeli bias. Israel's diplomatic mission to the UN in Geneva rejected the findings. Hamas did not immediately respond to a request for comment. According to Israeli tallies, 1,200 people were killed and about 250 were taken hostage in the October 7th attack. The Palestinian Health Ministry says the military retaliation in Gaza has since killed over 37,000 people. The reports, which cover the conflict through the end of December, found that both sides committed war crimes, including torture, murder or willful killing, outrages upon personal dignity, and inhuman or cruel treatment. The report added Israel also committed additional war crimes, including starvation as a method of warfare. The COI statement said some of the war crimes, such as murder, also constituted crime against humanity by Israel, using a term reserved for the most serious international crimes knowingly committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilians. On the report on the October 7th attack, the Commission verified 4 incidents of mass killings in public shelters. It said that suggests militants had standing operational instructions. It also identified a pattern of sexual violence by Palestinian armed groups, but could not independently verify reports of rape. The evidence gathered by such UN-mandated bodies has sometimes formed the basis for war crimes prosecutions and could be drawn on by the International Criminal Court. In May, the ICC Prosecutor's Office has requested arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief Yoav Gallant. The COI findings will be discussed by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva next week.
Inéluctablement à empêcher le gouvernement d'agir, ce qui devenait dangereux pour la France. Ensuite, il y a le sentiment de dépossession qui est le leur, le sentiment parfois de ne pas être assez écouté ou considéré. Le retour au peuple souverain est à mes yeux, dans ce contexte, la seule décision républicaine. Je suis convaincu que des sociodémocrates, des radicaux, des écologistes, des démocrates chrétiens, des gaullistes, et plus largement que beaucoup de nos compatriotes et de responsables politiques qui ne se reconnaissent pas dans la fièvre extrémiste, qui se retrouvent autour de quelques axes clairs que porte la majorité actuelle, peuvent travailler avec ces dirigeants et bâtir un projet nouveau, une fédération de projets, pour gouverner, pour agir au service des Français,
a Russian Navy frigate and a nuclear-powered submarine on Wednesday churned into Cuba's Havana harbor, a move the U.S. and Cuba said posed no threat, but was widely seen as a show of Russian force as tensions rise over the Ukraine war.
The visiting Russian warships to Cuba are Vladimir Putin's way of reminding President Biden that Moscow can challenge Washington in its own sphere of influence, too.
William Leo Grand is a professor at American University.
This geopolitical alignment has echoes of the Cold War, but unlike the first Cold War, the Cubans are drawn to Moscow now not by any ideological affinity, but by economic necessity. Cuba is in a desperate economic situation, and Russia is the only country that has been willing to provide significant help, just as it did during the Soviet era.
The stopover coincides with Cuba's worst social and economic crisis in decades, with shortages of everything from food, medicine, and fuel, and growing discontent on the streets. According to Russia's defense ministry, the 4 Russian vessels sailed to the communist-run country on Wednesday after conducting high-precision missile weapons training in the Atlantic Ocean. Cuba's foreign ministry said the fleet carried no nuclear weapons, something echoed by U.S. officials. Curious locals, fishermen, and police looked on.
It impresses me a little because I have never seen something so close, such a large ship of that magnitude.
Last week, Cuba said the visit was standard practice by naval vessels from countries friendly to Havana. The U.S. has been monitoring the Russian vessels as they skirted the nearby Florida coast. On Wednesday, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that such naval exercises were routine. The Russian ships are expected to remain in Havana until June 17th.
The EU is slapping new import tariffs of up to 38.1% on Chinese electric vehicles. That's over what Brussels sees as excessive subsidies given to makers there. European Commission Vice President Margaritis Schinas.
This value chain benefits from unfair subsidiarization, which is causing a threat of economic injury to EU battery electric vehicles producers. On this basis, the Commission has reached out to the Chinese authorities to discuss these findings and explore possible ways for resolving the issues identified.
Exact levies vary by brand, with Beijing's state-owned firm SAIC hit the hardest at 38.1%. Brussels said it would set tariffs for BYD at 17.4%, while another Chinese giant in Geely hit 20%. Companies that cooperate with the European investigation could face a lower rate. Wednesday's news follows less than a month after Washington quadrupled its duties on Chinese EVs to 100%. The moves come amid alarm among European and US automakers over an influx of cheap cars from the country. BYD saw its European sales triple last year, albeit from a low base. MG, a unit of SAIC, is gaining market share fast. Numerous other brands from the country are preparing to launch cars in Europe. Beijing has rebuked the EU over its probe into EV subsidies. Officials have urged cooperation and lobbied against the imposition of tariffs. On Wednesday, China's Commerce Ministry said it would take all necessary measures to safeguard the legitimate rights of Chinese automakers. It further said the bloc's decision violated global trade rules. Officials have previously called the US tariffs bullying and said they were evidence that some Washington policymakers were losing their minds.
Shein is doing big price hikes for its clothes ahead of a planned share listing in London. That's according to analysis by research firm Edited. It says the online giant raised the average price for women's dresses by 28% in the US over the past year. Across France, Germany, Italy and Spain, the increase was 36%. Those numbers are far higher than the price hikes at rivals like H&M and Zara. The share sale may be a factor, with Shein set to face higher costs as a public company, a status that brings additional regulation. It will also have to comply with EU rules on online platforms, which could also add to its expenses. Retail experts say Shein wants to signal to investors that it can sustain growth and sell more higher-priced items. One said that could boost the price it gets for its shares in the IPO. Media reports say the company is seeking a valuation of around $64 billion in the sale. It reportedly selected London after encountering pushback from US lawmakers over plans for a listing there. The China-founded firm has faced criticism over labour practices in its supply chain, charges it strongly rejects.
It was another banner day for the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq Wednesday, with both indexes notching record closing highs for the third straight day. The latest inflation data showed consumer prices in May were softer than expected, and the Federal Reserve at the conclusion of its latest two-day policy meeting held interest rates steady. But the U.S. Central Bank projected only one interest rate cut this year, down from its previous prediction of 3, which led the major indexes to come down off their session highs. The Dow actually closed down 0.1%, while the S&P rose about 0.9, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq added 1.5%. Helping to power the market, Apple, which rose nearly 3% after announcing AI additions to its iPhones earlier this week. The company's market cap actually passed Microsoft's during the session, helping it reclaim its post as the most valuable company in the world. The continued market dominance of mega-cap tech companies is concerning, says Wealth Alliance President and Managing Director Eric Ditton.
3 stocks are now 20% of the S&P. Has that ever happened? No. That is as lopsided as we've been. and we know who they are. We know the offenders, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Apple. This is very much a two-tiered market. It's a narrow market. Advanced declines going the wrong way. New highs, new lows going the wrong way. I don't even want to talk to you about small cap stocks. Minus 4% a year last 3 years. So it's these big tech stocks that are carrying the day. How high do they go? No one knows.
Shares of Microsoft rose nearly 2%, and AI chip leader NVIDIA rose more than 3.5%, and Oracle surged 13% after it forecast strong revenue growth above estimates.
Все равно даже тогда я не думала, что да, мой путь приведет сюда. Но вот, к сожалению, очень хотелось быть полезным. То есть первые дни войны мы все жители города работали на укрепление, чтобы сюда не прошли, не дай бог, не попасть в оккупацию. Мы очень дружные были, работали, и в дальнейшем оно как-то вот естественным путем сложилось. Вот, и...
Звичайно, населення не дуже сприймає як молодих дівчат, які працюють в розмінуванні. Вони думають, що таке, але ми відносимося до цієї роботи як з натхненням. Ми усвідомлюємо всю небезпеку цієї роботи, але ми відповідальні, ми працюємо за стандартами операційних процедур.
Там бывает, он с девушки приходит, там муж служит, да, у нее там ребенок, они тоже хотят идти вроде как служить, но понимают, что лучше эта работа, это безопасней. Несмотря на то, что мы находимся на минном поле, это работа безопасна, если все сделать правильно.
Спочатку всі дуже хвилювалися, звичайно, але потім вони зрозуміли, що це є в нашій Україні зараз, на даний момент, це дуже, ми потребуємо цього. Хто, як не ми, зможемо це зробити.
Die Schwammstadt hilft uns auch erst recht, wenn wir einen Klimawandel haben, denn dann kommt noch mehr Regen oder wir haben noch längere Phasen, die trocken sind. Also die Schwammstadt hilft uns, das Regenwasser vor Ort zu halten, für die Vegetation verfügbar zu machen. Es hilft uns auch, schonender mit Trinkwasser umzugehen, sodass wir weniger Trinkwasser verbrauchen. Und es hilft natürlich auch dabei, Überflutung zu verringern. Es schafft die Überflutung nicht ab, aber die Überflutung zu verringern.
Anders als diejenigen in einem normalen Stadtteil trocken. Und Sie haben ein Kind. Okay.
Und das, was besonders ist, ist, dass hier das Regenwasser komplett vor Ort bewirtschaftet wird. Es wird hier gesammelt auf Gründächer, in Versickerungsmulden und dann größtenteils eben in diesem Regenwasserbecken.
Also wenn man reinfährt, ist es stickig, es ist heiß und den Unterschied merkt man auch durch die Wasserläufe, dass es einfach kühler ist, die Luftfeuchtigkeit ist ein bisschen höher, ist viel angenehmer.
أكبر محمول يلي حملت الراية مستشهد انت.
إذا كانت رسالة العدو في النيل من قائدنا وحبيبنا وعزيزنا الشهيد أبي طالب، إذا كانت رسالته النيل من عزيمتنا لنتراجع عن موقفنا في إسناد المظلومين والمجاهدين والمقاومين في غزة الأبية، فعليه أن يعلم أن جوابنا القطعي والحتمي والذي لا تردد فيه بعد هذه الدماء الزاكية لقائدنا الغالي والعزيز، أن جوابنا بعد استشهاد أبو طالب سنزيد من عملياتنا شدة وبأسا وكما ونوعا ولينتظرنا في الميدان.